The Caribbean Sea has long been treated as an American lake, a geopolitical swimming pool where Washington sets the rules, patrols the perimeter, and evicts anyone who dares to swim without permission. For nearly 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine has been the invisible fence around the Western Hemisphere, a warning to old world powers that this half of the globe is the exclusive property of the United States. But this week, that fence didn't just break, it was torpedoed, sunk, and humiliated. We are witnessing a moment of profound strategic vertigo. The Wall Street Journal has just confirmed a report that should send a chill down the spine of every naval strategist in the Pentagon. The Bella One, a rusting, insignificant oil tanker, part of the so called Shadow Fleet, has become the epicenter of a nuclear standoff after the U.S. Coast Guard spent 2 humiliating weeks chasing this ghost ship, attempting to enforce a blockade on Venezuela that the rest of the world increasingly ignores. Moscow didn't just issue a diplomatic protest. They didn't just send a strongly worded letter to the UN. They sent a nuclear powered submarine. Let that sink in. In the waters that the United States considers its own backyard, a Russian submarine surfaced to escort a sanction busting tanker, effectively placing a nuclear shield between a U.S. enforcement vessel and its target. This is not just a breach of a blockade, it is a shattered illusion. The optics are devastating. The world's greatest superpower, the indispensable nation, has been reduced to playing a cat and mouse game with a derelict vessel, only to find itself staring down the periscope of a Russian hunter-killer. This is the Suez moment of the Western Hemisphere, a flash of lightning that reveals the empire is naked, overstretched, and utterly defied. To understand the gravity of this, we must look back. We are seeing the ghost of October 1962, but with a pathetic twist. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States had the moral and military clarity to draw a line in the ocean. Kennedy's blockade was a display of absolute maritime supremacy. The Soviet Union blinked. They turned their ships around because they knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the U.S. Navy owned the Atlantic. Today, the roles are reversed, but the script has degenerated into farce. The U.S. is not blockading nuclear missiles. It is obsessively hunting barrels of oil. It is deploying billion-dollar assets to stop a decrepit tanker from engaging in trade that half the world now facilitates. And this time, the rival power isn't blinking. Moscow is demonstrating that it can operate with impunity in the American sphere of influence. They are proving that the U.S. Navy, for all its budget and tonnage, cannot police every inch of the ocean against a determined adversary who refuses to play by Washington's rules. This incident with the Bella One is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a systemic collapse. It exposes the central lie of the current American foreign policy, the belief that sanctions are a magic wand that can compel obedience without cost. We have sanctioned Venezuela, sanctioned Russia, sanctioned Iran, and sanctioned anyone who does business with them. But sanctions only work when you have a monopoly on the global economy. That monopoly is gone. What we are seeing in the Caribbean is the physical manifestation of a new multipolar reality. The rules-based international order is a euphemism for American command, and Russia just drove a submarine right through it. The Bella One is no longer just a ship. It is a symbol. It represents the global South's refusal to starve quietly. It represents the resilience of a parallel economy that has emerged specifically to defeat American coercion. Washington is reacting with predictable outrage, citing international law and maritime protocols. But the hypocrisy is suffocating. This is the same power that seizes assets at will, that weaponizes the dollar system to crush dissent, and that claims the right to patrol the South China Sea while screaming aggression when a competitor enters the Gulf of Mexico. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. The empire is flailing, trying to swat at flies while the wolves circle the camp. The thesis of this analysis is simple but uncomfortable. The era of uncontested American maritime dominance is over. The Monroe Doctrine has been repealed not by a treaty, but by the reality of steel in the water. As we move forward, we will dissect how this single tanker exposes the fatal flaw in the U.S. strategy, a strategy built on the arrogance of a bygone era, unable to cope with a world that has learned how to say no. This refusal is not merely rhetorical, it is structural, operational, and increasingly militarized. The incident with the Bella exposes the catastrophic failure of the primary weapon in the American arsenal, the weaponization of the financial system. For decades, Washington has operated under the delusion that it could control the behavior of sovereign nations, not by occupying their land, but by strangling their bank accounts. The theory was elegant in its cruelty: cut a nation off from SWIFT, deny them maritime insurance, sanction their shipping registry, and they will collapse. It was a siege warfare tactic for the digital age, bloodless for the aggressor, but devastating for the populace. But the enemy gets a vote, and the target adapts. What we are witnessing in the Caribbean is the maturation of the shadow economy. When the West blocked Russian and Venezuelan oil from the mainstream markets, they didn't stop the oil from flowing. They simply forced it underground. They created a vast parallel logistical network that operates entirely outside the jurisdiction of Western law. The Bella is a perfect specimen of this new species of defiance. It is likely insured by Russian or Chinese state-backed entities, flagged in a jurisdiction that ignores U.S. writs, and paid for in yuan, rubles, or gold. The United States Coast Guard spent 2 weeks tracking this vessel, operating under the assumption that the old rules still applied. They assumed that eventually the crew would surrender, or the captain would bow to the pressure of a radio hail from a U.S. cutter. That assumption is a relic. The Bella didn't stop because it didn't have to. It is plugged into a support system that Washington can no longer intimidate. This is the nightmare scenario for the U.S., a sanctions regime that has been completely bypassed. The arrival of the nuclear submarine changes this from an economic dispute into a kinetic reality check. It signals that the Shadow Fleet is no longer just a commercial workaround, it is a protected strategic asset. Moscow is effectively saying, if you want to seize our oil, you will have to sink our Navy. The U.S. establishment has no answer for this. They are built to fight asymmetrical wars against insurgents in sandals or to levy fines against compliant European banks. They are not built to physically contest the transit of commodities defended by nuclear-powered escorts in the Western Hemisphere. This is the direct consequence of the weaponization of the dollar. By turning the global reserve currency into a tool of political coercion, the United States forced its adversaries to build an alternative architecture. We pushed Russia and China together. We pushed Iran and Venezuela into the same lifeboat. And now that lifeboat has nuclear torpedoes. The axis of resistance, or as I prefer to call it, the coalition of the sanctioned, has realized that if they hang together, the U.S. cannot hang them separately. Consider the panic this induces in the corridors of power in D. C. The entire U.S. leverage over the global energy market relies on the threat of interdiction. If a Russian sub can escort a tanker to Havana today, what stops a Chinese flotilla from escorting a convoy to Caracas tomorrow? The precedent is shattered. The monopoly on violence in the Caribbean, taken for granted since the Spanish-American War, has evaporated. The media narrative, of course, tries to spin this as Russian aggression. They focus on the provocative nature of the submarine, ignoring the provocation of the blockade itself. They want you to believe that the U.S. has a divine right to starve Venezuela, and any attempt to break that siege is an act of war, but the global South isn't buying it anymore. Brazil, India, South Africa, they are watching this standoff and they are taking notes. They see a superpower that is visibly frustrated, lashing out at a rusting tanker because it can no longer command the obedience of the world. The circumvention is total. It's not just about the oil, it's about the mechanism of exchange. The Bella represents the physical flow of goods, but the financial flow is equally important. This oil wasn't sold for dollars. It didn't pass through a New York clearinghouse. It is part of the de-dollarization trend that is accelerating every time the US uses the currency as a bludgeon. Every sanction is a sales pitch for the BRICS alternative payment system. Washington is now trapped in a dilemma of its own making. If they attack the Bella 1 or the submarine, they risk World War III over a tanker of crude. If they do nothing, they admit that the blockade is unenforceable and that the Monroe Doctrine is dead. They are paralyzed. And in geopolitics, paralysis is the precursor to collapse. The system is failing not because it lacks firepower, but because it lacks authority. The rules based order turned out to be a house of cards, and the Bella one just kicked the table. But we must peel back the layer of strategic incompetence to reveal the rotting core of moral hypocrisy that lies beneath this standoff. The true horror of the situation in the Caribbean is not the presence of a nuclear reactor underwater. It is the sanctimonious lie that brought us here. The United States justifies its blockade of Venezuela, its sanctions on Russia, and its strangulation of Cuba with the soaring rhetoric of democracy promotion and human rights. This is the great moral trap of the American empire, the delusion that we are the benevolent architects of freedom, when in reality, we have become the chaotic engineers of suffering. Let us be brutally honest about what this blockade represents. It is not an attempt to liberate the Venezuelan people. It is a medieval siege designed to starve a population into submission because their government dared to nationalize its resources. This is the standard operating procedure of the Washington establishment. Whenever the State Department begins to weep for the plight of a foreign population, one need only look at a geological survey map to find the real motivation. The tears of our diplomats always seem to fall on soil rich in hydrocarbons, lithium, or strategically located near a choke point. The world has seen this script before, and the ending is always a graveyard. We need only look at the recent history of American interventionism to understand why the global South is cheering for the Bella one. Look at Iraq. We were told we had to invade to stop a madman with weapons of mass destruction. There were no weapons. There was only oil, gold, and a desire to project power. The result was not democracy. It was a million dead civilians, the birth of ISIS, and the utter fragmentation of a sovereign state. We broke the country, stole its future, and then shrugged when the chaos spilled over borders. Look at Libya. This is perhaps the most damning indictment of the Western moral crusades. Muammar Gaddafi was a thorn in the side of the West, yes, but he presided over the most prosperous nation in Africa. He had a plan for a gold backed African currency that threatened the dominance of the French franc and the US dollar. So, under the guise of responsibility to protect, NATO turned the most developed nation in North Africa into a failed state. Today, Libya is not a democracy. It is an open air slave market ruled by warlords. This is the freedom we exported. We destroyed a functioning state and replaced it with a vacuum of terror. Look at Syria. We spent billions arming so called moderate rebels to overthrow a secular government, only to watch those weapons end up in the hands of religious extremists who beheaded children. We prolonged a civil war for a decade, not to save Syrians, but to block a pipeline and deny Russia a foothold in the Mediterranean. We used the Syrian people as firewood to keep our geopolitical furnace burning. This is the track record that the U.S. Navy brings to the Caribbean. When they attempt to seize the Bella one, they are not enforcing law. They are enforcing a mafia protection racket. The message to the global South is clear. Give us your resources on our terms, or we will turn your country into Libya. The blockade is a weapon of mass destruction in slow motion. It denies medicine to children, parts for power plants, and food for the hungry, all to trigger a regime change that serves American interests. The moral trap is that the United States has believed its own propaganda for so long that it cannot see the monster it has become in the eyes of the world. We scream about sovereignty in Ukraine while violating the sovereignty of nations in our own hemisphere every single day. We condemn Russian aggression while occupying a third of Syria and stealing its oil. The hypocrisy is so dense, it has its own gravitational pull. This is why the presence of that Russian submarine is so psychologically damaging to Washington. It interrupts the narrative of the good sheriff. A sheriff doesn't starve the townspeople to catch a thief. A sheriff doesn't burn down the village to save it. The U.S. has lost the moral high ground so completely that when a Russian nuclear asset surfaces in the Caribbean, half the world views it not as a threat, but as a necessary counterbalance to a bully. The consequences of this coercion are now coming home to roost. By using the financial system and the military to punish independence, the U.S. has created a market for protection. Russia is simply filling that market. The Bella one is proof that nations would rather risk nuclear escalation with the assistance of Moscow than submit to the economic strangulation of Washington. We have made American friendship expensive and American enmity survivable. We have taught the world that the only way to be safe from American democracy is to have a nuclear armed friend standing next to you. The tragedy is that the American people are dragged into this moral abyss by an establishment that views war as a business model. We are told we must defend freedom in the Caribbean, but we are really defending the profit margins of energy conglomerates and the ego of a foreign policy blob that cannot admit it was wrong. The blockade is a crime, and the submarine is the evidence that the victim has found a weapon. This specific incident in the Caribbean serves as the opening salvo of a much darker, broader phenomenon, the global reckoning. We are moving past the phase of diplomatic tension and entering the era of reciprocal escalation. For 30 years, American foreign policy has operated on the arrogant assumption that we can deploy military assets to the borders of our rivals in the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Taiwan Strait without ever facing a corresponding threat on our own coastline. We believed we possessed a magical immunity to the laws of geopolitical physics. But Newton's third law applies to empires just as it applies to mechanics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The presence of Russian nuclear assets in the Western Hemisphere is the direct, inevitable reaction to the expansion of NATO and the militarization of the Indo-Pacific. Washington has spent decades poking the bear and taunting the dragon, secure in the belief that the oceans provided an impenetrable shield. That shield has now been pierced. The message from Moscow is unmistakable. If you place missiles in Ukraine and troops in the Philippines, we will place submarines in Cuba and Venezuela. The strategic depth that the United States has enjoyed since 1812 is gone. The front line is no longer in the Donbass or the South China Sea. It is off the coast of Florida. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare. The United States spends nearly $1 trillion a year on defense, building massive aircraft carriers and gold-plated fighter jets designed for a conventional war that will likely never happen. Meanwhile, our adversaries are investing in cost-effective, high-impact capabilities designed to bypass our strengths and exploit our vulnerabilities. They are not trying to match us ship for ship. They are outmaneuvering us. A single submarine escorting a sanctions-busting tanker achieves a strategic victory that a dozen carrier strike groups cannot undo. It renders our overwhelming force irrelevant because we cannot use it without triggering a catastrophe. We must also look at the silent partner in this escalation, China. While Russia provides the kinetic hardware, Beijing provides the economic architecture that makes this defiance possible. The global south is mobilizing not with armies, but with trade agreements and currency swaps. This is a diplomatic mobilization that is isolating the West. When the U.S. Navy tries to enforce a blockade, they are finding that the international community they claim to represent is actually a shrinking minority of G7 nations. The rest of the world, the global majority, is actively helping the Bella One reach its destination. They are providing the insurance, the markets, and the political cover. This geopolitical standoff translates directly into a domestic nightmare for the American citizen. We are accustomed to thinking of foreign policy as something that happens over there, a TV show that doesn't affect our daily lives. That delusion is ending. The asymmetric warfare being waged against the U.S. empire is economic as much as it is military. When shipping lanes in our own hemisphere become contested zones, insurance rates skyrocket. Supply chains, already fragile, will fracture. The cost of energy will not be determined by the free market, but by the level of risk in the Caribbean. This is the inflation of empire. Every dollar we spend trying to police the world, every sanction we impose that forces trade into the shadows, devalues the currency in your pocket. The Bella One is part of a systemic attack on the petrodollar. If oil can be traded, shipped, and protected without the US dollar and the US Navy, then the dollar ceases to be the world's reserve currency. When that status is lost, the infinite credit card of the American government gets declined. The hyperinflation that follows will make the current economic woes look like a golden age. Furthermore, this escalation creates a profound instability in our national security. By seeking to make Russia and China less safe, we have made ourselves less safe. The establishment has traded the security of the American homeland for the vanity of global hegemony. We are now in a situation where a miscalculation by a Coast Guard captain or a Russian submarine commander could vaporize Miami. We have sleptwalked into a Cuban Missile Crisis too, but this time we have no Kennedy, no diplomacy, and no off ramp. We only have the rigid, unthinking momentum of a war machine that knows only how to escalate. The global reckoning is the realization that the U.S. can no longer dictate terms. We are entering a period of chaotic multipolarity where regional powers will assert their rights by force if necessary. The blockade of the Bella One was meant to be a show of strength. Instead, it became a demonstration of impotence. It proved that the U.S. military is overstretched, its bluff has been called, and its rivals are willing to play chicken with nuclear stakes. The empire is not just in decline, it is being actively dismantled piece by piece by a coalition of nations that have simply stopped being afraid. The chaos we sowed in the Middle East, the instability we fomented in Eastern Europe, it is all boomeranging back to the Western Hemisphere. The Atlantic Ocean is no longer a moat, it is a highway for our adversaries. As we move to the final analysis, we must ask, is the preservation of this failing hegemony worth the risk of total annihilation? Because that is the question the Bella One poses to the White House. And right now, the silence from Washington is deafening. This brings us to the precipice of history, the twilight of empire. The incident with the Bella One is not merely a naval standoff. It is a mirror held up to a superpower in decline. The United States is now facing the same existential choice that the British Empire faced at Suez in 1956, or that Rome faced in its final tumultuous century. The choice is binary, and it is unforgiving. On one hand lies the path of adaptation, a return to realism, humility, and restraint. This path requires the American establishment to accept that the unipolar moment is over, that the world is vast and pluralistic, and that we must coexist with other great powers rather than trying to subjugate them. It requires abandoning the delusion that we are the world's policemen and focusing instead on rebuilding our crumbling republic at home. On the other hand lies the path of illusion, a desperate, prideful clinging to the myth of hegemony. This is the path of coercion, of doubling down on failed sanctions, of risking nuclear war to save face in the Caribbean. It is the path of the gambler who has lost everything but throws his house keys on the table, convinced that the next hand will restore his fortune. Tragically, the reaction from Washington suggests they have chosen the latter. They are raging against the dying of the light, unable to comprehend a world where their word is not law. They are willing to burn the geopolitical architecture to the ground rather than share power within it. We must understand that American exceptionalism was never a moral truth. It was a historical anomaly born of the fact that the rest of the world was in ruins after World War II. That anomaly has corrected itself. The global south has risen, Russia has rearmed, China has industrialized, the playing field has leveled, but our psychology has not. We are still operating with the arrogance of 1,991 inches, the reality of 2024. The Bella One sailing calmly past a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, flanked by the silent menace of a Russian submarine, is the tombstone of that arrogance. It proves that the liberal international order was only liberal for those who obeyed, and international only as long as the West controlled it. Now that control is gone, the mask has fallen, revealing only raw power dynamics. The danger now is not that the United States is weak, but that it is fragile. A fragile empire is unpredictable. It lashes out. It creates crises to distract from its internal decay. The blockade was a manufactured crisis that backfired, and in its failure, it revealed the limits of our reach. The world has seen that the emperor has no clothes, and more importantly, the emperor has no leverage. The psychological hold of the empire has been broken. Fear, which was the currency of our dominance, has experienced hyperinflation. It is worthless. As we stare into this abyss, we must realize that the greatest threat to the American people is not in Moscow or Beijing, it is in Washington, D.C. It is the hubris of a ruling class that would rather risk World War III over a tanker of oil than admit they were wrong. They are sleepwalking us into a catastrophe driven by an ideology that views compromise as weakness and peace as appeasement. The Bella One has delivered its cargo, but the real delivery is the message. The world has changed, and if we do not change with it, we will be broken by it. This channel exists to speak the truths that the corporate media is paid to suppress. We analyze the world as it is, not as the State Department wishes it to be. If you refuse to be a pawn in their narrative, if you demand to know the reality of the shifting global order, then you know what to do. The mainstream media is the PR department of the empire. We are the autopsy report. Subscribe to the channel, like this video to break their algorithm, and share this analysis with everyone who is tired of the lies. I want to hear your voice in the comments below. Answer these two questions. First, do you believe the United States should risk a direct military conflict with Russia to enforce a blockade in the Caribbean? Or is it time to abandon the Monroe Doctrine? Second, is the rise of a multipolar world a threat to American freedom? Or is it the only thing that can save us from the tyranny of our own globalist establishment? The debate begins now. I'll see you in the comments.